Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the second of 3 video lectures about Wu Mingyi's novel, The Man with the Compound Eyes. Please also take a look at the brief introduction I made to Wu Mingyi's life and works. In the previous video lecture, I talked about The Man with the Compound Eyes as being a novel full of islands, unstable islands that are constantly shifting. Some, like the island of Trash, are on the move. And I want to talk a little bit more in this video about movement. But not just movement of islands, or movement of people, or movement of other life forms, but also the movement of stories. Wu Mingyi's novel itself has traveled abroad and been translated into multiple foreign languages. It has also recently been adapted for the stage by a German director for a Taiwan theater company. So in this video lecture, I want to focus on The Man with the Compound Eyes as a novel about writing. First, let's talk about where all of these different flows of people and trash and other things are converging. It's Taiwan in the Vortex, and specifically the city of Hualien, which is referred to as H City and H County in the Chinese edition and as Haven in the English edition. We have traveling species, including migrating butterflies. We also have migrating stories. The name of one of the main characters, Alice, calls to mind Alice in Wonderland. And I think Alice actually has several different wonderlands. She kind of creates a wonderland for herself and trying to cope with the loss of her loved ones. And we have a meeting of sorts between two bereft writers, Attila and Alice. Both of them do writing, and both of them read each other's writings. This is a novel that is very metafictional in that it is writing about writing, and we have a lot of authorial self-reference within this novel. And there are some revelations that occur later in the novel about whose story is this, and how many stories are there. So we'll say hello or Ohio to the avatars of creation, as I would call them, that we can find in this novel. I'll just mention a couple of them here. One is Wu Ming-yi, who appears in somewhat disguised form as the character M, translated as Ming in the English translation. The title character himself, the man with the compound eyes, is also revealed to be a writer. Late in the novel, Alice tells Attila that she has finished 2 works of fiction, and Attila asks, "What is the name of it?" She asks, "The long one or the short one?" "The long one, The Man with the Compound Eyes." "And the short one?" "It's also called The Man with the Compound Eyes." And in fact, Wu Ming-yi himself had written a short story called The Man with the Compound Eyes before he wrote the novel The Man with the Compound Eyes. I also want to mention just briefly a couple of differences between the Chinese edition of the novel and the English translation. One is that at the beginning of each chapter or section, and then we have chapters within the chapter, we have these little synopses or invocations of some of the themes and events of that particular section. There's also an author's afterword in which Wu Ming-yi himself invokes W.B. Yeats's "To Some I Have Talked With by the Fire." This is the poem where we get the epigraph for this novel from. Wu Ming-yi talks in the afterword about how the Great Pacific Garbage Patch was an inspiration for this novel, how he wrote the novel in different fragments over 3 years before finishing it while on sabbatical at a university in Western Taiwan. He also talks about the commissioning of an illustration for the first Chinese edition of the novel. He also borrows Yeats's idea of this kind of scenario of storytelling intimacy, where it's both the storyteller and the listeners around the fire, and we're talking, we're having a conversation. Some people are falling asleep or nodding off. Other people's faces are kind of aglow with the rapture of the story. Before saying more about Wu Mingyi's novel, I want to mention just in passing that there was an earlier celebrated novel by one of Hualien's native sons, Wang Zhenhe, who wrote a novel called Rose, Rose, I Love You, 玫瑰，玫瑰，我爱你. This is set in Hualien itself. And this is a story set during the Vietnam War, where you have U.S. troops coming over to go fight in Vietnam that are staying temporarily on the east coast of Taiwan, or having rest and recovery there. And what do? They go visit the brothels. And so we have these brothel owners and all of the prostitutes preparing to welcome GIs to Taiwan. The sex trade can, of course, spread venereal disease, which is a type of global flow that does not recognize national boundaries. But this novel also takes its title from a pop song that had been around since the 1930s and had Mandarin editions, it had English editions, and it had circulated on kind of a regional circuit and eventually globally through the airwaves. So this is to say that Wu Mingyi's The Man with the Compound Eyes is not the first novel to use the east coast of Taiwan or Hualien specifically as this kind of convergence point for global flows of culture. Trash, of course, is another type of culture. If you think about all the global flows and the travelers that we encounter within this novel, we have both human and non-human travelers. We have the garbage, we have sperm whales, we have a tsunami that wipes out an island, we have the waves of trash, we have Chinese, we have indigenous, and we have European characters. We have travels through the mountains and forests of Taiwan, We have travels over the oceans. We have travels over the ice. Tom appears as something of a hyper-traveler, and we wonder, this is someone who's been everywhere. Is Taiwan just another adventure for him? Let's focus for a moment on how stories travel within this novel, and also how traveling itself is the making of stories. One striking scene during Alice's travels is when she goes to Stockholm and she goes to the city library and sees this temple of the written word, this kind of palace of books, which inspires a type of awe or feeling of the sublime. Alice is a writer herself who thinks that finally someone has got it right in venerating the written word in this way. This was the most beautiful book repository Alice had ever seen. This is a real place and undoubtedly one of the best public libraries in the world. One of the places that Alice and Tom visit, and which Alice particularly likes, is the story room within this library, which has an enormous chair. And it seems like the person sitting in it reading the story has a type of magical power. Alice, of course, calls to mind Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that Lewis Carroll story from the 19th century, in which Alice goes down a hole following a rabbit and encounters a cat. Ohio! I would mention that Alice's Adventures in Wonderland also traveled into the Chinese language context as early as the 1920s. Wu Ming-yi typically illustrates his own novels and non-fictional works, but for the first edition of The Man with the Compound Eyes, he actually had a different Taiwan illustrator create this kind of Wonderland image. This was not one that Wu Ming-yi himself had any input on, so this is a projection of that particular artist. To me, it represents characters and events in the novel in ways that I never imagined, but it certainly presents it as something of a wonderland. So one of the global flows and confluences that I see in this novel is this human culture of writing. Atelier is something of a trashy writer because he literally writes with trash, with these thrown out twigs, which turn out to be pens, on the garbage island. And so it's really when he is floating on this garbage island of trash that he turns into a writer and he starts writing on the only surface available, his own body. And writing for Atelier is a way to ease his own pain. So there's a kind of succor to be gotten from the act of writing. He worries that he's been forgotten. He worries about the people he has lost. And his writing is the most personal of acts. Atelier is not the only character in the novel who writes on his own body. Hafei recounts that when she was young, she would also write a watch onto her wrist, almost like she's trying to arrest time. Alice is not only a writer, she is also a reader, and when she is trying to figure out what happened with Tom and Toto, she lies on Toto's bed looking up at the ceiling where she sees this map. This is a map which she eventually decodes when she is underwater on a later visit. Later in the novel, when Atelier is telling us part of his story, his perspective on events, he regards Alice essentially reading him, reading the inscriptions on his body. So again, we have multiple meetings between Atelier the writer and Alice the reader, as well as Alice the writer and Atelier the reader. So we have a mutual imagining or a mutual communion between writer and reader being imagined in the story. So many of the characters in The Man with a Compound Eye seem to be searching for a story, and searching in multiple different directions. So at one point there's even this mention of a Japanese dream grabber therapy. That sounds like this high-tech way to get you in touch with your subconscious. But even this technologically mediated type of storytelling may not tell the story in a comprehensible way. Or it may only tell the story in a way that's comprehensible just to the individual involved. And just keep in mind for our next discussion that a lot of the output of this dream grabber therapy is represented as images. As Atelier tells the story, I asked her what she was writing and she said she was writing a story. What are you writing a story for? I'm writing a story to save a life, she said, I guess. But not every character writes to live. Key is another writer who has lost a loved one, but he actually dies by his own writing. He seals the doors and windows and starts burning his manuscripts and letters, and he succumbs due to inhalation of the smoke and fumes of his own writing. We also have discussion about the medium of expression or writing, about different types of paper. Or we remember that Atelier writes not only by kind of scrawling on his own body, but also playing a special musical instrument. Wu Ming-yi himself also appears as a character in this novel, disguised as M or Ming, and Ming the misanthrope. Ming is a colleague and friend of Alice's, and he takes them to photograph tree frogs at night, something that Wu Ming-yi actually does with his students. And many writers like to do this, as we've seen elsewhere in this course. Wu Ming-yi also includes a little bit of self-mockery. Alice thought Ming was acting like someone with an anxiety disorder. He was so negative about everything, and writing made him even more uptight. It had been a few years since his last novel, and he had writer's block. When the man with the compound eyes is speaking to the dying Tom, who is lying there immobilized with his compound fractures, he mentions that animals have memories too. It's not just human beings. But only human beings have invented a tool to record memory. The man with the compound eyes reaches down and takes out a pencil he has stuck in his pant leg. The pen is broken in two, but there is no doubt it can still write. Writing. So the man with the compound eyes is a very ambiguous character. He seems to be kind of a personification of nature or of some kind of ecological consciousness. But he's also represented as a writer, and he says here that only human beings have used this tool to record memory. So again, he appears as something of a human entity. I would argue that the man with the compound eyes presents a vision of writing itself as a type of ecological activity. Writing, of course, has the function of keeping memories alive, so he tells Tom earlier, your wife's writing kept your son alive. Actually, he had died long before. But he also says that only human beings can, through writing, experience something separately together. So this is an ecology that seems to transcend time and space and bring people together. The man with the compound eyes claims that he cannot intervene to save a life, he can only look on. But he does impart knowledge in saying things like, no life can survive without other lives. Without the ecological memories other living creatures have, memories of the environments in which they live. So even if animals cannot write, they can still remember, and we need to incorporate that into our own ecological consciousness.